So my name is Kevin Corder. I'm in the Department of Political Science in the College of Arts and Sciences at Western. And I do research in American politics, both public policy and political behavior. And recently my work has focused on the voting behavior of women. First, right after suffrage from 1920 to 1936, and now a broader look at a century of votes for women. So we tackled this open question of what happened with the women's vote after 1920. Women were granted the right to vote in 1920. Nobody was quite sure what was going to happen. One group of people thought that women would be relatively disinterested, apolitical, wouldn't show up, their vote choice would be volatile. Another group of people looked at women's political experience before and decided, well, women are going to be active and engaged in politics. And the question was out there, but we really haven't had a satisfactory answer because there weren't exit polls, there weren't surveys, and there weren't kind of detailed information about political behavior that we have now. So we asked this question, what happened with women's vote after 1920? We focused in 10 states for 5 elections, collected a lot of geographic data, counties, wards, precincts, and looked at the number of women and men and the number of votes for Republicans and Democrats and other parties, and used a statistical technique called ecological inference to then recover the individual proportion of women who voted for particular parties and proportion of men who voted and how many turned out, and we were able to reach some conclusions about what actually happened. And the 2 conclusions that jumped out at the research were that, number one, women tended to be even more partisan than men in the states where they were incorporated in the electorate. So Republican states that were historically Republican, became more Republican because women were more Republican than men. States that were historically Democratic, like the southern states and Virginia, became more Democratic because women were more Democratic than men. So although on balance, the impact of women didn't make much of a difference nationally, the Republican states became more Republican and Democratic states became more Democratic. The second big takeaway from the research was that women were less likely to support third parties. Men were more likely. So communists, socialists, temperance, prohibition, progressive, all of those parties received less support from women, not more. So third parties weakened. And even when there was a big surge in the third party support for Robert La Follette in 1924, women were less important to his mobilization than men. So that was a big surprise because people thought that women were going to have distinctly different political preferences than men, and they did not. We looked at, and our project is unique because we collected some data from geographic units, and we really tried to use a statistical technique that would tease out exactly how women voted and how men voted, and that was the first time people had those estimates. Before, people relied on 2 sources. One was scholarship that came out close or near to the incorporation of women in the electorate, that were using techniques that we now know to be flawed, or sources of data that we now know to be suspect, and they reached some conclusions that became entrenched as conventional wisdom, that women's suffrage was a failure because they didn't have any real impact on the composition, on the majority in Congress or in any other meaningful way. That was the kind of conventional wisdom. The other thing was press accounts. So we really took a close look at how contemporary journalists, or journalists at the time, looked at and understood what happened when women entered the electorate. And the journalistic conclusion was also, women's suffrage was kind of a failure. We doubled the size of the electorate. Nothing really happened. The majority in Congress didn't change. We didn't get radical public policy choices. So that was kind of a big waste of time. We doubled the electorate. We made it more costly, but we didn't get any new outcomes. And that conventional wisdom stuck for a long time. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to see. Was there really no meaningful change? And of course, immediately, when we start to disaggregate across states, we find that women did have a big impact, that they were more partisan, more Republican in Republican states, more Democratic in Democratic states. So that challenges that conventional wisdom. The expectation for why women would be different was their actual political activity in the past. Women had been associated with the anti-temperance movement. They had been associated with child labor, with restricting child labor. They had been associated with the movement for anti-corruption. They'd been associated with the movement for better schools, better food for their families. So women had these distinctive political ideas that they'd worked on and mobilized for in the past. But what we found was that unique political identity was channeled into the 2 major parties immediately. It did not result in new parties emerging or in existing third parties becoming stronger. So I think that our surprise was that women were channeled into the direction of the 2 major parties, and both major parties got stronger in places where they were already dominant. Well, one of the things that we're trying to understand is what happens when you incorporate new voters. I mean, the women's suffrage is a special example of that, and it's a big one because you can double the size of the electorate. But there's many new democracies emerging all over the world, and a lot of people want to know, well, what happens when people start voting for the first time? How does that work procedurally? How do they work with establishing a political identity? And so what our work suggests, and some scholars of contemporary African politics have already started to notice this, is that as a democracy emerges, voting's new. That act of actually showing up and casting a ballot, people are sometimes confused about how that works and what's actually involved. But the idea that you have a political identity, that's not new. People have already been thinking about who their allies are, what positions are, how their people in their group are going to vote. So when you're politically activated, it's new to vote, but it's not new to think of yourselves as a political actor with a well-formed, kind of even partisan identity. And I think that's our broader contribution is, look, when you think about new voters, they're not new political actors, they're new voters. They have a political identity, they just haven't exercised the right to vote. So you're not going to get, their political activism has been channeled in other ways, now it's channeled through the vote. Maybe you don't get huge disruptive changes when you bring in new groups because they're already politically active, just not in the form of voting. Well, the incorporation of women into the electorate showed us that the wild expectations about the total corruption of democracy by introducing women and expectations about the total reform of democracy by women's virtues being introduced into politics, both of those are wrong. It was a lot more stable than we thought. And the political apparatus, the Republican and Democratic parties, absorbed those new voters in ways that weren't very disruptive. It didn't mean women's suffrage didn't matter. It just meant that it wasn't as disruptive as we thought it was going to be, either positively or negatively. So I think that people will observe, well, what if we expanded the U.S. electorate from its dismal participation rate of 50-something% to 75%? Would that really be a huge disruption? Well, maybe not. If those actors that are channeled into politics move into either of the major parties, not as disruptive as you might expect. Well, the next step in this project is to extend beyond those early elections all the way up to the most recent 2016 election. And to do that, the data gets better and more refined and more reliable as we move closer to 2016, but we're really looking at what happened in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s as women's role and status in society changed. How was that reflected in their vote choice and in turnout? And as we learn more about women and their behavior in the electorate, how does that challenge some of the women's suffrage's failure ideas, and how was that transformed over time? And one of the things that I mentioned in the scholar talk was that one of the immediate changes was it went from women aren't going to turn out and women aren't going to be interested to, well, women just vote like their husbands. So failure doubled the size of the electorate, but women are impressionable, they vote like their husbands, so it really doesn't matter. And that was kind of a retreat from women aren't going to engage to they're going to engage, but they're going to be just like their husbands. And then, of course, today, there is a gender gap in support, with women more likely to support the Democratic Party, and women are more likely to turn out than men, so we can't rely on that second story of vote like their husbands either. So the story has evolved in a limited way, but doesn't really capture the fact that, look, today women are more likely to participate in presidential elections and women are more likely to vote Democratic. So do have not a totally distinctive voice, but a little bit different voice and definitely a little bit more active voice. The project, the Women's Ballots project, was a collaborative effort with Christina Wolbrecht at the University of Notre Dame. We've been working together since about 1998 on various aspects of this project. We got a grant from the National Science Foundation. We wrote a couple of book chapters and articles together, and that work proceeded over a course of years. So it's a very, very rich collaboration, I think, for both of us. And people that we knew in graduate school were instrumental in developing the methods that we ultimately exploited, where we kept up with them and they knew about our project, and as they released software that would be useful to us, we were able to adapt that. So there's really a broader network of collaborators, but the specific relationship that I've had with Christina has been very productive, and that reflects the fact that I couldn't take this on by myself. The idea that you take on a huge project where you're trying to figure out the voting behavior of women over 100 years. I can tackle some of the methodological details. Christina can tackle some of the details related to political parties, and together we can come up with a much more compelling story than we could, either one of us, trying to handle this on our own.